Welcome back. Well, the world didn't stop turning while we've been off the air over Christmas, and this week we're back in business with two issues likely to stay on our political agenda for the rest of the year: the cannabis IQ controversy and Fiji's rough ride back to democracy. For most of last year, it looked like Fiji was making progress with preparations for an election next year, an election that would see the end of the interim government that's been ruling the country since the military coup back in 2006. A special independent commission presented its recommendations on a new constitution to the country's president 2 days before Christmas. But 24 hours later, Fiji police moved in and seized all copies of the document before it could leave the government printers. The president claimed the draft constitution neglected many of the fundamental principles of true democratic representation. He's asked his Prime Minister, Commodore Bainimarama, to produce a new one. And last week, Fiji's interim government followed up with another decree. It bans trade union officials, members of the Employers' Federation, public servants, members of the judiciary, the military and the police from acting as party officials or being in the minimum of 5,000 members required for a party to qualify for the election. Well, that's a short headline summary, but to probe beyond the headlines, we're being joined now by the Director of the Pacific Media Centre, Professor David Robie. David Robie, thanks for joining us. Now, it obviously ended in tears, but how did the Constitution Commission start off?
Well, in the early days, it actually started off reasonably amicably, and for good reason, because the head of the Constitutional Commission was Professor Yashkai, who was known to the Attorney General as Syed Kaum. Knew him for quite some time, actually, and at one stage Yashkai had actually sort of supervised his master's thesis, you know, so there's a long-standing rapport, if you like, between them. So in those early days, it seemed to be a good choice. That Professor Guy had good respect around the traps, and he was expected to come up with a really good constitution draft.
Well, it seemed to go to clay very quickly, because as soon as the decree was published, setting out the terms of reference for this commission, Professor Guy was critical.
Yes, well, he had quite a number of reservations in the process, and he had fairly unanimous support from his fellow commissioners.
What was he objecting to?
Well, basically, I don't think he felt that he had enough of a free hand, and there wasn't enough grounds for consultation generally. And he felt quite strongly that he could actually sort of address this and improve things. But probably the sticking point came with the appointment of Ratu Choni Mundariri, who was the former vice president and opponent of the regime right from the time of the coup in 2006.
No, I understand that Ratu Choni is known. He was actually employed as a consultant by the Commission, and yet he'd been politically active. Now, wasn't there a rule saying you can't do that?
Well, essentially, that wasn't supposed to happen. But I think from the regime's point of view, they were not consulted about this, and it was sort of done rather secretly. And so they were most unhappy with Professor Guy about that. And in the end, you know, it sort of the relationship spiraled downhill fairly rapidly from then on.
Wasn't there another issue? Wasn't there a requirement that the Commission actually grant immunity to a number of people, including the Prime Minister of Fiji, for taking part in coup?
Essentially, that's the bottom line. I mean, the Bainimarama and his fellow coup leaders and so on have to have an exit clause, and so this is essential, the bottom line for them, that to ensure that they actually have immunity, otherwise retain control. And that sort of unfolded in a sense. I think that was another point of where the regime felt that there's a breach of faith not only with Ratu Choni, but the final draft constitution didn't explicitly, you know, have this immunity.
I'll come back to it in a moment, but what was known was that that was one of the particular terms that the Commission itself took exception to. And our Foreign Minister was in Fiji last July. Was he aware that there were these concerns when he announced that New Zealand was contributing $500 million to get this constitution drafted?
Oh, I think he's fairly aware that there were hiccups, but probably they considered that hiccups could be certainly resolved. But in the longer run, they never were. The situation just spiraled and got worse and worse. And of course, it's just equally important for Australia too. They put in $1 million into this whole process.
Okay, but I mean, were the Commission's initial concerns addressed before New Zealand, Australia and Fiji were announcing that we were going to exchange high commissioners, resume diplomatic relations, and have a relaxation of the travel sanctions?
I don't think satisfactorily. I don't think they were resolved satisfactorily, but in a sense there was a separate process involved. The tripartite sort of negotiations and agreements that were reached about the exchange of high commissioners and so on were based around the process that was going ahead with the Commission. In the fact that the Commission, there were reservations already emerging within the Commission's process, didn't really directly come into that.
Okay, just after that announcement, we heard that Fiji's last elected Prime Minister was sentenced to jail for corruption. Was that expected?
Oh, I think it was fairly widely expected for quite some time. Of course, there is a view that the process was actually a political vendetta in a sense against Ngarasi. Lassina Ngarasi was a former banker before he became Prime Minister, and he was sentenced to a year imprisonment for corruption during the period when he was on the board of Fijian Holdings. And so that was seen as rather vindictive because it was so far ahead of the time that he became Prime Minister. However, he's also facing, I understand, further charges of corruption during the period as Prime Minister, and he would be facing those next month.
Well, he was leader of one political party. Are there any other political parties whose leaders also face charges? Well,
to be perfectly frank, right through that last democratic government of Ngarasi, I mean, it's an open secret, the allegations of corruption for a long time before the coup happened in 2006. But of course, those sorts of taints, those sorts of allegations have been against a number of political leaders as well. But the thing is that the SDL is of course the party that pushed the Indigenous paramountcy under that last elected process that led to the coup.
Yes, the old being Karasei's
but
party.
The Fiji Labour Party, you know, there's also allegations about the leadership there with Mahinda Chaudhry.
Okay, the Karasei, of course, is associated with Ratu Johnny Matraiwi. Now, how close was that association?
Well, I'm not sure that there's really an
counted?
association so much as that when Ratu Johnny was Vice President, he, of course, was very opposed to the coup. But that was on principled grounds. As a prominent lawyer and judge before he became Vice President, he felt from a legal perspective there's no way that he can possibly support an illegal usurpation of the democratic government. So that was a principled stand that he took, rather than any particular association between him and Ngarasi or Ngarasi's government.
Well, as you pointed,
but I think, you know, that's what's happened since then, and this was complicated the Constitutional Commission's process because Ratu Johnny was involved with an SDL submission to the Constitutional Commission that advocated essentially Indigenous paramountcy, and so that would seem.
So there he was as a consultant to the Commission, a paid consultant to the Commission, and as a submitter to the Commission.
Yes.
Well, wasn't his position compromised?
I think many would argue that that was the case, and certainly the regime took that view. Yeah. And that probably, in many respects, that probably was the really damaging, you know, sort of event that really undid the good work of the Commission overall.
Yes, because at that point, I think there was another decree issued, and they actually changed the terms of reference for the Commission and the Constituent Assembly, which would deal with the Commission's recommendations. What was the impact of that?
Well, the impact was really set up the process that would inevitably mean that the draft constitution was going to fail. the regime had taken the view that they weren't going to get what they wanted, and so they obviously planned ahead before the draft document came out to produce something of their own.
Effectively, the chairman of the commission, Professor Guy, has said that this will lock out any further public hearings on either the Constitution with the Constitutional Commission or the Constituent Assembly, which is yet to actually even be named.
Yes.
Is that the case?
And that's pretty well the case. It's hard to see that there's going to be any real, genuine public consultation.
About what time would you imagine that the Fijian government would think this is going to cause a hell of a stink? This isn't what most people would be expecting as we try and manoeuvre our way towards an election and democracy?
No. But then it's the track record of the regime. They've never really taken into account seriously what the rest of the world thinks, particularly Australia and New Zealand. The bottom line is to have a constitution that is going to see the end of the old political era, the party-based system that was essentially a failure from independence.
Yes, and of course last week we saw yet another decree issued, and this one regulates the conduct of political parties. Now, how does this decree look in terms of its international acceptability?
Well,
a number of people have been banned from participating in political life.
Yes, it's hard to see how any genuine political process can take place with such a draconian arrangement for parties. And it's clearly aimed at Ngarassi's party, SDL. But ironically, that is the party that's probably the best, well, certainly in the best position to deal with this new decree. And of course, they've only got until the end of next month for all parties, and there are 16 parties in the political framework in Fiji, but for all these parties to re-register, and they have to find 5,000 members in this 1 month period. And of course they've barred people who are
yes, trade unionists, militia, police, corrections service officers, trade unionists and members of the Employers Federation.
And any members of the party in the past that have had, been in jail in the last...
with the grand exemptions of the President and the Prime Minister.
Exactly. But it's clearly aimed against Ngarassi. They want Ngarassi entirely out of the political framework, and it probably means that it could be the end of the Fiji Labour Party in its present form. See, I mean, probably the scenarios that could develop out of this would mean that possibly 2 or 3 of the largest parties may be able to meet the deadline and the frameworks. Other parties might have to sort of slip beyond the registration period and then look for regrouping. Or we end up with a united opposition framework across all parties, which seems to be what's happening now.
So how do you see the situation developing from here, particularly given the interest that both China and the United States are now taking in Pacific affairs?
Well, it's very interesting that the last couple of years we've seen the US particularly take an interest in the Pacific in response to China's growing influence in the region generally, but particularly in Fiji. The last 2 forums, the Pacific Islands Forums meeting in Auckland the year before last, and then last year in the Cook Islands, both China and the US had huge delegations of about 50 members in each, for both those years. And then of course we had Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who went to the Cook Islands last year. So there's clearly a repositioning and rivalry there. But one of the things that's not really considered terribly well, I think, within the political frameworks in Australia and New Zealand, is that whole role that not only China but also India play, because both of those countries have really been sympathetic, at the least, if not possibly undermining for Australia and New Zealand's position anyway, and yet they haven't really been consulted.
You know, listening to all the track record of events dating back to July last year, and looking at what we've seen in the mainstream media of New Zealand, just how well served do you think we've been?
Oh, very poorly served. I mean, the situation is very, very complex. On the one hand, it seems very straightforward. We've got a military regime. We've got to get rid of this military regime or military-backed regime and get back to democracy as soon as possible. But the political configurations in Fiji are quite complex, and without a systematic and comprehensive coverage of the developments in Fiji and the rest of the Pacific, our public are not going to be terribly well informed, and also it's not going to feed into public policy terribly well. And so, with a few notable rare exceptions like Radio New Zealand International and a few individual journalists, there's hardly any coverage at all, and really the coverage only comes when the crises in the region and in Fiji blow up every so on, and unfortunately we don't get enough about the background.
Is this crisis time?
Well, I think it's certainly the ongoing crisis. But part of the reason I think that the media coverage needs to be a lot more comprehensive and more in depth is we have to understand the nature of the beast and why the regime is acting the way it is and what it's trying to do. Because unless we understand the bottom line of what they're going to achieve or to hope to achieve, what they claim is that it's the first time that Fiji will have a genuine democracy, one person, one vote, and doing away with race-based politics, which has marred Fiji, the political scene, ever since independence. But it's a bizarre way of going about it if that's what they claim, and on the other hand, every step and every block on the way is anti-democratic.
Professor Robie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor David Robie, Director of the Pacific Media Centre. And coming up, does early cannabis use damage your IQ? Well, do young teenagers using cannabis run the risk of stunting their intelligence? Yes, say the authors of a Dunedin study based on data from a group they've been tracking for the last 40 years from their birth. And no, says a Norwegian analyst who's built a statistical model that demonstrates that poverty can have exactly the same impact. So who's right? Or could both be right? To find out, we're talking to an analyst who's been looking at both those studies. He's Professor of Biostatistics at the University of Auckland, Thomas Lumley. Professor Lumley, thanks for joining us. Look, if either of these studies actually established or disproved a direct link between early cannabis use and deterioration in IQ?
I think a direct link might be too strong. So the Dunedin study provided better evidence than we'd had before to suggest that the association between lower IQ and cannabis use was actually a result of cannabis, but it's by no means conclusive.
Okay.
And the Norwegian study suggested that it was even less conclusive than the Dunedin authors thought.
And suggested as an alternative that socioeconomic factors, and really specifically poverty, could be more of a factor.
Yes, that's right. So the Norwegian economist, Dr. Rogeberg, suggested that what happens is that people in lower socioeconomic groups who have jobs and recreational activities that look less like IQ tests tend to do relatively worse on IQ tests as they get older, and so you get this sort of decline.
Is there any truth in that?
There's some evidence for this. The model that he was using is partly due to Flynn, who's a famous New Zealand researcher in this area and who's been interested in the environmental effects. And basically, IQ tests seem to be like anything else. If you practice them, you get better.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And if your daily life includes things that look like it, yes.
Right. I'd like to focus on the Dunedin study, which you suggest actually does give a stronger indication of a linkage. That is we've got a database study that's based on information gathered from just over 1,000 people who've been tracked since birth in Dunedin 40 years ago. Now, how safe is it to generalise from the base of data gathered from one group of people born at the same time in the same place?
Yes. Well, it depends a bit on what's really,
what
the explanation really is. So if the explanation is really sort of biochemical, that cannabis is doing something to your brain cells, then presumably it would do something to your brain cells even if you lived somewhere with nice weather. And so it wouldn't be specific to Dunedin. But if it's a cultural or sociological phenomenon, then it would be different in different places. It might be fairly similar across New Zealand, but it might be very different in, say, Arabia or North America or somewhere.
Okay, but just how good is that tracking of that group over a period of 40 years? Now, I know a lot of people, I come from Dunedin,
Yep.
and a lot of people I know left Dunedin as soon as they could.
Well, yeah.
People shift, people
Yeah.
change,
They
people
do.
different things.
And that's one of the difficult things about running a cohort study.
Is it a
But
good one?
the Dunedin cohort study is really extremely good.
Yeah.
And so at their 38-year-old follow-up, they got 96% of the living people back, which is outstanding. And so they've really got very good data on these 1,000 people, and they're currently starting to bring them back again for another visit.
Okay, I mean, I think it'll be very interesting to see what the ageing effects are,
Yes.
because it's going to be the first time we've seen that tracked over time. But about 5% of that study group, I understand, were considered to have been cannabis dependent or had used the drug more than once a week before the age of 18. How does that compare to what we know about cannabis use among young New Zealanders generally?
Well, I don't know how it compares to 40 years ago, which is when, or 30 years ago, which is when it was taken. It's not far off what the surveys are suggesting now, so that the all ages proportion is about 6%, and it's a bit higher. Cannabis use generally is a bit higher in younger people. So 5% may be a bit low, but not very low compared to the population now.
Over the period between 18 and 38, these young Dunedinites showed an average, I think, of 8-point deterioration in their IQs. Wouldn't a lot of other people have done exactly the same thing?
Well, this was a difference relative to the people who didn't smoke cannabis.
Okay.
So IQ tests ideally are standardized so that they don't change with age, at least at younger ages. But yes, it's the difference between the regular heavy cannabis users and the rest that makes this interesting.
Let me turn now to the Norwegian study by Dr. Rogeberg. What do you know about? I mean, have you had a chance to really look at his study too?
I've looked at his paper, and what he did was basically, he said that they hadn't addressed specifically socioeconomic status in the original Dunedin publication, but that from general principles and from some other papers from the Dunedin group, you'd expect that cannabis use would be higher at lower socioeconomic status, and that there was independent reason to believe that you'd get a greater decline in IQ in people of lower socioeconomic status. And so that would be an alternative explanation for what was reported.
Well, you don't agree with them, do you?
Well, I agree that it was a plausible explanation.
Yes.
And it was. I mean,
but in terms of a critique of this particular survey.
Well, as a critique of the survey, I think he was quite right that the original Dunedin research didn't take this into account, and it could have been an alternative explanation of what they found. After his paper came out, the Dunedin group did some more analyses, and those analyses suggest that while this could have been the explanation, it actually wasn't. So
how was
what
that
they
demonstrated?
did was, so they did a number of analyses trying to statistically control for socioeconomic status. The simplest one, and in some ways the most dramatic one, is they just restricted the data to people whose parents had particular group of what they described as middle-class occupations, and then saying that among that group there's not a whole lot of variation in socioeconomic status, so that couldn't be the explanation.
Okay, well how did Dr. Rogeberg's simulation actually come up that there was such a socio-economic link?
So he wasn't saying that there definitely was, he was saying what would it take, what would the relationship have to be in order to explain what they saw in the study. So we know that in general you'd expect more cannabis use at lower socioeconomic status, and that Dunedin's in fact reported this, and that you'd also expect relative decrease in IQ. And if you put together the numbers that you'd expect over a plausible range of those numbers, the association that you'd see that was really due to a socioeconomic status would be about the same as what they saw in the Dunedin paper. So he in his analyses, it didn't explain all the decrease, but it explained quite a lot of it, and it added a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, so
and he specifically said that his results didn't discredit the Dunedin analysis, but they did suggest that it was less conclusive than the authors had claimed.
Well, you're a biostatistician. Tell me this in an unbiased fashion. If you had to choose between a study that involved a statistical simulation, if you like, if you had to look at that, and then look at one using actual data from actual people, which approach would be more likely to produce an accurate result?
Well, it depends on how well you can measure the things. So
Yes.
if you're talking about something you can't measure well, then you may get a more reliable idea by saying, okay, what values of this are plausible, and doing a simulation, rather than treating the things you measure as if they're exactly right. So, for example, if you ask people how much alcohol they drink, and you measure how much alcohol is sold in stores, there's a huge gap. So we know that asking people how much alcohol they drink, they lie.
Okay.
Or they have failures of recall or whatever.
And isn't it likely that perhaps the people who said they didn't smoke cannabis might have lied?
It's possible. In this
And
case,
therefore there'd be a bigger variation.
it is, and that's a possible explanation as well. That you'd normally expect that to make the effect go away rather than make you see an effect. What you'd need is a sort of complicated pattern where people at low socioeconomic status with higher IQ lied more, which is possible, but it's, that would be another possible explanation.
Okay. Are there any other studies that show links between other forms of substance abuse, such as tobacco or alcohol, or other environmental factors, or even variations in individual diet and fitness, and IQ deterioration?
I don't think there are for tobacco. For alcohol, prolonged heavy alcohol use is known to cause certain types of brain damage and mental illness. I'm not an expert on this area, but there's, for example, something called Korsakoff's psychosis.
I know, I just thought you might have observed it as you reviewed various biostatistical analysis.
And there's lots of suggestions that diet might prevent loss of memory and loss of cognitive function in old age. The data isn't wonderful. I mean, the data on diet is very hard to collect well.
Now, final point. You are quoted as saying that the whole analysis is not relevant to public policy because no one's suggesting that cannabis should be legal under 18.
Well,
why do you say that?
I mean,
is
that's
that,
an exaggeration.
is that correct?
It's an exaggeration, I think, that there are. But I think the serious proposals for decriminalisation or legalisation would mostly treat it like alcohol and have a minimum age.
I would have thought there was one thing that would have had an impact on public policy, and that is that the result could guide you on how to target more effectively a campaign to make people aware of the danger.
Yes, and I think that this result would be, provided that you don't go too far in overstating its certainty, that it would be quite a good thing to include in health promotion messages. I don't think it's going to be very important in decisions about legalisation or decriminalisation, though.
Do you think it'd be convincing?
Well, the question is whether it's convincing to teenagers.
A lot of people, that's the point.
Yes, and it may well not be. I mean, health promotion is a sort of specialised subfield of marketing as well as of health research, and I don't know whether it could be framed in a way that would be convincing. But if it could be, then I think the level of evidence is sufficient that it would be ethical to do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thomas Lumley, Professor of Biostatistics at Auckland University. And that's it for now. We'll be back in a week with more of our nation's newsmakers on the Beatson interview. Till then, thanks for your company.
supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.